So I'm going to talk about fictionality. Literary scholar Elaine Freedgood writes that the realist novel, quote, is characterized by its twin commitments to fictionality and referentiality. But what is fictionality? Ostensibly, fictionality is the quality of being fabricated. For example, Peter J. Rabinowitz claims that no competent reader picking up Crime and Punishment has any trouble recognizing the murder as invented and the locale St. Petersburg as real. Here, the invented means the fictional and the real means the referential. Consequently, in literary theory, the division between fiction and nonfiction is almost taken for granted. But this is precisely the problem. While fictionality seems self-evident, scholars in the 21st century have started to question whether what we think of as fictionality is perhaps more than the quality of being invented. We now ask, for instance, how conceptions of the fictive, unlike the real, in society influence our distinction between fiction and nonfiction in literature, and vice versa, or how the distinction between truth and lies intersects with the fictional and the referential. Now, the amount of scholarship produced over the last 15 years testifies to the complexity of the term, and this is just a partial list of recent works arranged chronologically. The list is by no means exhaustive, and I will focus on two items in particular, but it does show the growth in the study of fictionality in the 21st century. Browse, Gibbons, and Hatavara relate the increased focus on fictionality to the changing distinctions between truth and lies in the so-called post-truth age, where the boundary between reality and fiction seems increasingly hard to distinguish. Politicians spin stories, everyday reality, and social media is invested in live narratives. Historical events are narrativized in literary text. Fantasy as a genre is more popular than ever. And new genres, such as autofiction and fan fiction, blur the boundaries between autobiography and artistic creation on the one hand, and referentiality and readerly reception on the other. Now, because the idea of fictionality is increasingly permeating narratives of daily life, including political rhetoric, in this paper I suggest that an understanding of how fictionality is conceived in literary theory might illuminate how it influences political imagination. I'm specifically interested in two questions. One, how do narratives train readers to distinguish between the real, the fictional, and that which remains unknowable in between the two? And two, how does the balance between individual and collective as sources of plausibility and imaginative agency undergird the truth value assigned to narratives? Now, there's been much writing on the lessons that fiction teaches us, including empathy, history, and the ability to imagine different realities, even the future. In focusing on fictionality, my aim is to complement this view by asking not only what novels teach us, but how they teach us. Since I can't give an overview of all the literature on fictionality, I will focus on the highly influential framework proposed by Catherine Gallagher in her article, The Rise of Fictionality, which sparked many of the consequent debates. Gallagher focuses on the European realist novel in the 17th and 18th centuries, arguing that the novel may have said to have discovered fiction, in the sense that what we now call fictionality, and what she calls novelistic fictionality, is a specific set of expectations or beliefs with which readers distinguish fiction from reference, the real from the invented. Gallagher maintains that the realist novel in Europe was preceded by literary traditions in which there was no conception of fictionality as we think of it today. Instead, narratives before the realist novel were one of two things. One was fantastical and poetic genres, which made no direct referential claims, like epics, poetry, mythology, so that readers knew them to be fabricated, but understood them allegorically, or credible stories that were seen as accounts of real people and real places. Against this background, novelistic fictionality introduced plausibility as the foundation of the text's truth claims, based on the suspension of disbeliefs. Readers believe that fictional narratives tell them something about the real world because they believe the story. They do not stop to question at every turn which part is real and which is fabricated. This, according to Gallagher, was made possible through fictional characters who were nobodies, in the sense about being about nobody in particular, for instance, having common names. These fictional nobodies were read as types that represent social collectives, so that plausibility depended on the collective. precisely because readers did not know whether characters on an individual level were based on real persons or not. Novelistic fictionality, then, is premised on two connected principles. One is a plausible correspondence between fictional characters and referential collectives, and two is an uncertain correspondence between text and context. In other words, fictional characters and events may be based on reality, but this information is irrelevant to the unfolding of the plot, since plausibility is established by the text itself. Ayelet Ben-Ishai uses the term commonalities to describe the function of collectives in realist novels, claiming that creating, maintaining, and reifying these commonalities, generating a we, was often far more important socially and politically than the ostensible purpose of the networks. Commonalities are thus collectives that balance the fictional and the real in a cyclical process where writing and reading about collectives takes part in constructing them. Now, importantly, Gallagher claims that understanding the ontological status of characters, the difference between literary persons who are real and who are invented, was a process that readers needed to learn. Imagine if you'd never heard of fiction or never read a novel and started reading one, you might easily think it is an account of real people. Therefore, readers had to be trained in deciphering characters as fictional entities. And this happened at first through the explicit mediation of the text themselves, that is, by the authors. Writing about the rise of the Danish novel, Simone Zetterberg-Javelsen mentions mechanism for training readers in understanding fictionality. For instance, prefaces, meta-reflexivity, and authorial commentaries were indicative of how important it was for the authors of the early novel to explain their enterprise. The prefaces explain how to read both the particular work and the novel as a genre properly. Literary scholar Dorit Cohen calls these mechanisms of establishing a work's ontological status signposts of fictionality. Many of these signposts are subtle narrative techniques, such as the use of omniscient narration, but they also include more obvious markers, such as the explicit subtitle, a novel, which is, of course, still used. Now, while these theories all focus on fictionality in novels, scholars use fictionality to ask how individuals represent society in other narrative genres as well. For example, Björnen and Hatavara and Makela discussed the genre of political storytelling, where politicians use personal stories to further their political causes, framing anecdotal experiential narrative evidence as exemplary of larger social or political issues, so that embedded utterances construct exemplary vocal positions. So for instance, they will give you a story about a poor farmer to further their agenda. Now, as these scholars recognize, the questions the political storytelling raises pertain to the mechanisms of making truth claims. And like fictionality, these are largely concerned with the relationship between the individual and the collective. For instance, it raises the question, what indicators clarify the correspondence between narrative and lived reality? How does one person's story become representative of a social problem? How do we believe in these stories, and what happens if an individual story turns out to be a lie? Finally, how does the accumulation of stories turn into socially sanctioned truth? Let me give an example. In recent years, there's been a flourishing of autobiographical texts about the experience of being Black, brown in Europe. Here are some examples, including books from the UK, Germany, Italy, Sweden, and Norway. Some of the authors were born in Europe, others migrated there. Some have one European parent, some don't. Some write in verse, some write prose. But what they all share is a focus on anecdotes from their lives. Personal experience is their source of plausibilities. These are autobiographical works. Now, there are several recurring tropes in these books, such as the insistent question, where are you really from? Or the juxtaposition of microaggression and systemic violence, and dealing with the N-word that people still use. The recurrence of these tropes suggests that they are experiences that are common to most, if not all, Black, brown people in Europe. But recently, I was challenged regarding this assumption of representability. I was talking to an elderly relative in Norway who had used the N-word. She had a hard time understanding why this was offensive. Norway isn't the USA after all. In response, I told her that I'd read many books about this, and that all Black, brown writers describe how the N-word is not only offensive, it makes them cringe physically. To this, she replied, Yes, but how do you know that all Black people feel this way? Perhaps those who write books are more sensitive than others. Maybe most people don't really care and don't want to get into these debates about racism. Now note the commonalities here. I was basing my truth claim on the assumption that these writers represent the collective of Black, brown people as a whole, whereas my relative countered by saying that the only collective they can represent is that of Black, brown writers. Here, the intervention that fictionality offers lies not in distinguishing fact from fiction or kind of asking whether the stories are true, but in drawing attention to the way narratives make meaning when there is an unknown correspondence between the individual and the collective. Since we can't know how all Black, brown people feel, the question is not what is true, or even how do we know what is true, but rather how do we believe what is true? And this is in many ways the same questions that novels interrogate through their suspension of disbelief and its slippages between fictional characters and real social contexts. As such, one way to approach the question of how texts make their truth claims is to see how collectives are negotiated in writing. I'll give one example from an autobiographical book called I Talk About It All the Time by Gambian-Norwegian author Kamara Lundestad Diouf. Diouf's father is Gambian and her mother is Norwegian. And the book opens with an anecdote about how her Norwegian grandmother calls Kamara and her siblings the N children. Now the following scene takes place much later when she as an adult confronts her family about this nickname. I had the most important conversation about the N-word with my family. Beforehand, I went to the library, searched online, found articles in history books, and then I said, this is what they call us. This is slavery and segregation. This is race theory and dehumanization. This is post-colonialism, linguistics, and ignorance. This is racism. Now you know. Now you can't claim not to know. Now it is on you. And there is hardly anyone in the family who uses that word anymore. These conversations work. Of course, sometimes someone, after too much drinking on Christmas Eve, raises the issue. They say, come on, can't we? Why can't I? But I don't need to tackle it anymore. I'm not alone. Mom gets up, grandpa gets up, grandma gets up. They deal with it instead of me. They become a collective that defeats the stupidity so that I don't have to. Now, notice all the collectives here that Youth constructs in this paragraph. There is her family, sometimes the whole family, including Kamar herself, and other times only the white members of the family. There are the people who use the N-word, and there are the Black, brown people who get called the N-word. And finally, there is the collective that she has created through her storytelling, her family members who advocate against the use of the N-word because she has taught them its history. These commonalities are not fictive, but they are constructed through the networks that they represent. Now note how the book itself has the same function as this history lesson that Diouf teaches her family. By writing about racism and by including this anecdote, we, the readers, are taught that the N-word, what the N-word means to Black, brown individuals. We're also taught how to believe in Diouf's story because her family dramatizes the process of learning how to believe. They move from dismissing her perspective to accepting it. This mechanism of teaching these lessons and making this truth claim is one of constructing commonalities. That is, by reading about collectives, we implicitly get to decide which collectives we choose to belong to, those who use the N-word or those who don't, those who keep asking, but why can't we? Or those who stand up and explain why it is wrong. To return to the question that my relative asked me, perhaps we cannot know how many Black, brown people cringe at the use of the N-word, but that is hardly the point. The point is that by using the N-word, we polarize ourselves and our interlocutors into commonalities, which carry a heavy social and historical baggage. The point is also that we do not know how the individuals and the commonalities correspond, and it is not knowing that requires generosity, in my view. Writing and reading about collectives constructs them. This is a mechanism of fictionality, of making fabricated individuals convey social truth, but it is also a mechanism of political storytelling and of political imagination, where stories of individuals convey the stories of communities because they instill what Chiara Botticci in her keynote yesterday called socially sanctioned imaginary signification. Finally, going back to where I started, The post-truth era is, in my understanding, largely tied to new modes of fictionality, a shifting balance between how we know and believe what is real, what is invented, and what lies in between in the realm of uncertainty. This balance is shifting partly because of changes in commonalities, in the ways collectives construct themselves through narratives and thus become meaningful. Gibbons et al. Write that the interactive and transmedial quality of contemporary narrative forms all suggest a popular shift in the manner that audiences convey legitimacy and authority upon sources of news and information, rebalancing of power and prestige from authors to readers and audiences. They tie this to the influence of the internet, and particularly social media, which couples our access and exposure to information with our online identities, and meshing our conception of reality with our conception of ourselves and the social groups to which we belong. Note also here all the commonalities that underlie the way we make truth claims. Like Benedict Anderson's famous concept of imagined communities, belonging to a collective is not merely a matter of biology or place of birth, but a constantly constructed act of imagination, of ideology and belief, all the more when there are multiple and overlapping and changing collectives. As such, one of the ways to train the imagination to go visiting is quite consciously training ourselves to recognize how we construct commonalities to which we want to belong and through which we make meaning. Indeed, recognizing commonalities is an in-between space between what is real and what is imagined, between knowing and believing. In other words, political imagination is not just imagining together, but imagining the together. Thank you.